Chapter 1. A City Built on Water and Fear. In the early 1400s, Hamburg was not the confident, modern port city people recognized today. It was a place constantly balancing between opportunity and disaster, built on water that both sustained life and threatened to take it away. The River Elbe was Hamburg's greatest gift and its most dangerous curse. It carried ships filled with grain, salt, timber, and cloth, but it also brought disease, floods, and strangers whose arrival could change lives overnight. The city itself felt cramped and uneasy. Narrow wooden houses leaned toward each other as if sharing secrets. Streets were muddy more often than dry, and canals cut through neighborhoods like open wounds. At night, darkness swallowed the city quickly. Oil lamps were few, shadows were deep, and fear lived comfortably in every corner. Survival was not a philosophy. It was a daily calculation. Most people in Hamburg did not wake up thinking about ambition or success. They woke up wondering if the food would last the week, if illness would visit their home, or if fire would tear through the tightly packed buildings before morning. A single spark could destroy an entire street. A single cough could mean death within days. Hamburg's population was divided sharply by wealth, but fear touched everyone. Merchants and guild leaders lived behind thicker walls, but even they could not buy protection from plague or flood. The poor, crowded into damp quarters near the docks, lived closest to danger. Their homes smelled of smoke, fish, and rot. Children grew up fast because they had to. Many did not survive childhood at all. The city's location made it powerful, yet exposed. Hamburg sat at the crossroads of northern European trade, connecting inland towns to the open sea. Ships arrived daily from distant ports, carrying goods and rumors. News traveled by word of mouth, tales of wars, failed harvests, or entire cities wiped out by disease. Each story carried a warning. Hamburg could be next. Water shaped everything. Floods were a constant threat, especially during storms or harsh winters. When the river swelled, homes near the docks filled with icy water. People lost furniture, food supplies, even family members. There was no insurance, no safety net. What the river took, it rarely gave back. Winter was especially brutal. Cold seeped through thin walls, and firewood was expensive. Poor families burned whatever they could find. Broken crates, scraps from the docks, even old furniture. Hunger grew sharper when trade slowed and desperation followed close behind. Survival sometimes meant stealing bread or cheating scales at the market. Morality bent easily when starvation stood at the door. Disease loomed over the city like an invisible enemy. No one understood germs, only patterns. People noticed that sickness followed ships, that crowded streets bred death, and that certain neighborhoods suffered more than others. But without knowledge, fear turned into superstition. Many believed disease was punishment from God. Others blamed foreigners, the poor, or the river itself. Church bells rang often, not just for prayer, but for funerals. Death was familiar, almost routine. Bodies were carried through streets wrapped in cloth, and graves filled quickly. People learned not to grow too attached. Love existed, but it lived under constant threat. Yet Hamburg endured. That endurance was not heroic in the way stories often describe. It was quiet, stubborn, and exhausting. People survived by adapting, by learning when to fear the river and when to trust it, when to share and when to protect what little they had. Survival meant waking up again the next morning, even when the future looked no better than the past. This was Hamburg in the 1400s, a city alive with trade and terror, faith and fear, opportunity and loss. To survive here was not a single act of courage. It was a lifetime of small decisions made under constant pressure. And for the people who called this city home, survival was the only victory that mattered. Chapter 2. Food, Hunger, and the fight to stay alive. In 1400s Hamburg, survival often began and ended with food. What a person ate, or failed to eat, could decide how long they lived. Hunger was not an occasional hardship. It was a constant presence, a quiet threat that shaped daily choices and moral boundaries. For most families, the question was never about variety or taste, but about quantity and timing. Would there be enough to last until the next market day? Would supplies survive the winter? Bread was the foundation of life. Dark, coarse bread made from rye or barley filled most stomachs, especially among the poor. Wheat bread existed, but it was a luxury reserved for the wealthy. A bad harvest could turn bread from sustenance into scarcity overnight. When grain prices rose, panic followed. Families rationed carefully, cutting loaves thinner each day. Children learned early not to complain. Fish was Hamburg's second lifeline. The river and nearby sea provided herring, eel, and cod, often salted or dried to last through colder months. Fresh fish was common near the docks, but inland neighborhoods depended on preservation. Salt was precious. Without it, food spoiled quickly, and spoilage meant hunger, or worse, illness. Meat was rare for common people. When it appeared, it was usually tough, oversalted, or already beginning to turn. Markets were loud, chaotic places, filled with smells of smoke, fish, and sweat. They were also dangerous. Cheating was common. Scales were tampered with, bread was mixed with sawdust or ground peas, and spoiled food was disguised with spices. City officials tried to regulate markets, but enforcement was inconsistent. When hunger ruled, honesty became optional. The wealthy lived in a different world. Merchant families stored grain in private warehouses and drank imported wine instead of weak ale. They could afford spices, preserved meats, and fresh produce even in winter. But wealth did not remove fear, it only delayed it. Even rich households worried about shortages, theft, and rising prices. Hunger ignored class boundaries when times grew hard. Famine was the ultimate terror. A single failed harvest could cripple the city. When trade slowed due to war or storms, Hamburg felt it immediately. Ships that failed to arrive meant empty markets and rising desperation. People sold possessions to buy food, tools, clothing, even furniture. When nothing remained, some turned to begging, others turned to crime. Theft of food was widespread and quietly understood. Stealing bread was a crime, but it was also survival. Punishments existed. But many city guards looked the other way when hunger was obvious. A hungry child caught stealing might be beaten and released. An adult might not be so lucky. Hunger tested the limits of mercy. Women carried much of the burden. They managed household supplies, stretched meals, and found creative ways to feed families. Soups were watered down, leftovers reused, and scraps transformed into something edible. Children were sent to work early, not for ambition, but to bring home food. Even small wages could mean survival. Alcohol played a strange role. Weak ale was safer than water, which was often contaminated. People drank it daily, including children. It provided calories and comfort, dulling hunger and fear alike. Taverns became places of temporary escape, but also places where desperation could turn violent. Religious fasting complicated matters. The church required days without meat, which further limited diets. But faith also offered structure. Charity was encouraged, and monasteries sometimes distributed food to the poor. These acts were not enough to solve hunger, but they offered brief relief and hope. In Hamburg, hunger shaped character. It forced people to adapt, to bend rules, and to rely on one another. Survival was not about abundance. It was about endurance. Those who lived through the 1400s did so by learning how to stretch a loaf of bread, how to wait out empty days, and how to keep going when the body demanded more than the world could offer. Food was life, and in medieval Hamburg, life was never guaranteed. Chapter 3. Disease, death, and medieval medicine. In 1400s Hamburg, disease was not an occasional visitor. It was a permanent resident. People lived with the constant expectation that sickness would arrive without warning, carried by the air, the water, or the next ship docking along the river. Illness did not knock. It entered homes silently, and once inside, it rarely spared anyone. The most feared enemy was the plague. Even when it was not actively raging, the memory of it haunted the city. Entire families had vanished in past outbreaks, leaving empty houses and unmarked graves. People watched one another closely for signs: a fever, swollen glands, a persistent cough. A single symptom could turn neighbors into strangers overnight. No one understood the true cause of disease. Germs were unknown, and medicine was built on theories rather than evidence. Many believed illness was caused by bad air, known as miasma. Others saw disease as punishment from God. When sickness spread, prayers intensified, churches filled, and processions marched through the streets, often making outbreaks worse without anyone realizing it. Medical treatment was crude and dangerous. Physicians were rare and expensive, serving mostly the wealthy. Most people relied on barber surgeons, whose skills included bloodletting, tooth-pulling, and wound cauterization. Bloodletting was believed to restore balance in the body. In reality, it often weakened patients who were already fighting for their lives. Herbal remedies were common. Women passed down knowledge of plants believed to cure fever, ease pain, or ward off evil. Some herbs helped, others did nothing, and a few made things worse. But choice was limited. When death loomed, any hope was better than none. Quarantine existed in a primitive form. When a household was suspected of plague, doors were sometimes marked or watched. Sick people were isolated, not for their protection, but to protect the city. Many died alone, separated from family, comforted only by prayer. Fear outweighed compassion. Death was everywhere, and people learned to live beside it. Church bells rang constantly. Graveyards filled quickly, forcing bodies to be buried in shallow graves. During outbreaks, corpses piled up faster than they could be buried. The smell of death lingered in the air, especially in warmer months. Children were especially vulnerable. Many did not survive infancy. Those who did grew up surrounded by loss, attending funerals before they understood life. Parents loved deeply but cautiously, knowing attachment could lead to unbearable grief. This emotional distance was another form of survival. The rich fared slightly better. They could flee the city during outbreaks, retreating to countryside estates. The poor had no escape. They stayed, suffered, and died in greater numbers. Disease, like hunger, revealed the harsh inequalities of Hamburg's society. Religion provided meaning in the face of chaos. Death was seen as part of God's plan. Heaven and hell were not abstract ideas. They felt close, immediate. This belief helped people endure suffering, but it also discouraged questioning. If disease was divine punishment, then prevention felt impossible. Yet, despite everything, people adapted. They noticed patterns, avoided certain areas, and learned when to stay away from crowds. These small observations, passed quietly from person to person, saved lives even without understanding why. In Hamburg, survival meant accepting that death could arrive at any moment. People lived quickly, prayed often, and loved carefully. Disease shaped their worldview, reminding them that life was fragile and survival was never guaranteed. To wake up healthy each morning was not normal. It was a blessing. Chapter 4. Work, Trade, and the Hanseatic Lifeline. If food kept the people of Hamburg alive day to day, work and trade determined whether the city itself survived. In the 1400s, Hamburg's greatest strength was its position as a growing hub of the Hanseatic trade network. This alliance of merchant cities connected northern Europe through sea and river routes, and Hamburg stood as one of its most important gateways. Trade was not just business, it was survival. The docks were the heart of the city. From early morning until nightfall, they were filled with noise, the creak of wooden ships, shouted orders, splashing water, and the grinding labor of loading and unloading cargo. Sailors, dock workers, porters, and traders crowded the riverbanks. Many of them lived short, brutal lives. Work was dangerous, exhausting, and unforgiving, but it was one of the few reliable ways to earn food. Men worked hauling sacks of grain, barrels of salted fish, timber, and cloth. A single mistake, a slipping rope, a falling crate, a sudden wave, could cripple or kill. There was no compensation for injury. If a man could not work, he did not eat. Widows and children were left to fend for themselves, often forced into begging or low-paid labor. Craftsmen formed guilds to protect their trades. Bakers, brewers, carpenters, blacksmiths, and tailors relied on these guilds for regulation and limited protection. Guild membership offered stability, but entry was difficult and expensive. Apprentices trained for years, often starting as children, living with masters who controlled every aspect of their lives. For many, this was still better than starvation. Women worked constantly, though their labor was rarely acknowledged. They brewed ale, sold food in markets, cleaned fish, repaired nets, and took in laundry. Some worked beside their husbands, others worked alone after losing family to disease or accident. Their income was small, but essential. Without women's labor, many households would have collapsed. Children were part of the workforce early. By the age of 7 or 8, many were already working, running errands, helping at stalls, cleaning workshops, or assisting on ships. Childhood as a protected stage of life barely existed. Survival demanded contribution from everyone. Trade brought opportunity, but also risk. Ships faced storms, piracy, and shipwreck. A lost vessel could ruin dozens of families waiting for its cargo. When trade slowed, wages fell, and hunger followed quickly. The city's dependence on trade made it powerful, but fragile. Despite the dangers, the river was Hamburg's lifeline. It connected the city to the wider world and gave people hope. A successful trade season meant full markets, paid debts, and food on the table. A failed one meant desperation. Merchants who succeeded gained immense influence. They helped govern the city, fund defenses, and shape laws. Their wealth built churches, warehouses, and walls, but it also widened the gap between rich and poor. Still, even they understood one truth. Without trade, Hamburg would not survive. For ordinary people, work was endurance. Long hours, aching bodies, and constant uncertainty defined daily life. Yet through labor, the city endured. Every sack carried, every ship unloaded, every coin earned pushed Hamburg one more day into the future. In the 1400s, survival in Hamburg was inseparable from work. To labor was to live. And as long as ships continued to arrive on the Elbe, hope, however fragile, remained alive. Chapter 5. Crime, Punishment, and the Law of the Streets. In 1400s Hamburg, the line between survival and crime was thin and often invisible. When hunger, disease, and poverty pressed too hard, many people crossed that line not out of greed, but necessity. The city understood this reality, yet it responded with laws designed less to create justice and more to maintain fear and order. Crime was everywhere. Theft was the most common offense. Bread stolen from markets, fish taken from docks, firewood cut from private land. These were not grand crimes, but small acts of desperation repeated daily. Pickpocketing thrived in crowded streets and busy markets. Smuggling was common along the river, where goods could disappear quietly before taxes were paid. Violence was part of city life. Taverns often turned into battlegrounds fueled by alcohol, frustration, and exhaustion. Fights broke out over wages, insults, or stolen food. Knives were common tools, carried as much for work as for protection. Serious injuries were frequent, and many ended in death without consequence. The city maintained order through fear. Punishments were public, harsh, and meant to serve as warnings. Thieves were whipped, fined, or placed in stocks, where crowds mocked and sometimes attacked them. More serious crimes, repeat theft, assault, or murder, could lead to execution. Hangings were public events. People watched not out of cruelty, but because witnessing punishment was part of social control. Justice was unequal. The poor suffered the most severe penalties. A starving man stealing bread faced harsher punishment than a wealthy merchant cheating the market. Fines were common, but only effective against those who could pay. For the poor, fines meant deeper poverty or imprisonment. Night watchmen patrolled the streets after dark, carrying lanterns and weapons. Their job was to deter crime and raise alarms, but they were poorly paid and often corrupt. Bribes were common. Some crimes were ignored, others were punished brutally, depending on who was involved. Prisons were dark, filthy, and overcrowded. They were not meant for rehabilitation, only containment. Disease spread quickly inside them, and many prisoners died before their sentences ended. Being jailed was often a death sentence in itself. Despite this harsh system, communities sometimes protected their own. Neighbors looked away when someone stole food for children. Markets quietly allowed small thefts during hard times. These unspoken rules helped people survive when the law did not. Religion again played a role. Confession offered spiritual relief, even when punishment followed. Many criminals believed their souls could still be saved, even if their bodies were broken. This belief made suffering bearable. Crime in Hamburg was not a sign of moral collapse. It was a symptom of survival under pressure. The city's laws were designed to keep order, but they could not erase hunger or fear. People navigated this world carefully, learning when to obey, when to hide, and when to risk everything. In the end, survival sometimes meant becoming invisible, avoiding attention, and staying just one step away from the law. For many in Hamburg, that balance was the difference between life and death. Chapter 6. Faith, Hope, and the Will to Endure. In a city where death was common and survival uncertain, faith became more than belief. It became a necessity. For the people of Hamburg in the 1400s, religion was not something practiced only on holy days. It was woven into daily life, shaping how people understood suffering, endurance, and hope. When food failed, when disease struck, and when the law offered little mercy, faith remained one of the few sources of stability. Church bells marked the rhythm of the city. They called people to prayer, warned of danger, and mourned the dead. Churches were among the strongest buildings in Hamburg, made of stone rather than wood. They served not only as places of worship, but as shelters, meeting spaces, and emotional anchors. In times of crisis, people gathered there seeking protection, both physical and spiritual. Prayer was constant. People prayed for good harvests, safe voyages, healing from illness, and forgiveness for sins. Many believed that survival depended on God's favor. This belief offered comfort, but it also placed heavy emotional weight on individuals. Misfortune was often seen as punishment, leading people to search their lives for moral failure rather than practical solutions. Festivals and holy days provided rare moments of joy. Even in difficult times, the calendar offered breaks from hardship. Music, processions, shared meals, and rituals allowed people to feel human again. These moments strengthened community bonds and reminded people that life was more than suffering. Charity played a quiet but vital role. Churches and religious groups distributed food to the poor when they could. Wealthier citizens donated not only out of kindness, but out of fear for their souls. These acts did not end poverty, but they saved lives during the worst moments. For those receiving help, charity was not dignity, it was survival. Hope also came from community. Neighbors relied on one another during illness, childbirth, and loss. Women helped women. Men worked together. Orphans were taken in when possible. These small acts of solidarity created invisible networks of support that allowed people to endure when institutions failed. Faith shaped how people faced death. Heaven and hell were real, immediate destinations. This belief reduced fear and gave meaning to suffering. Dying well, confessing sins, receiving last rites was considered as important as living well. In this way, even death became part of survival. Yet endurance was not passive. People adapted, learned, and persisted. They found ways to rebuild after floods, recover after disease, and continue after loss. Survival in Hamburg was not about heroism. It was about resilience. By the end of the 1400s, the city had endured famine, plague, and hardship, yet it still stood. Not because it was strong, but because its people refused to disappear. Faith gave them meaning, community gave them support, and hope, however fragile, kept them moving forward. If you want more untold stories of how ordinary people survived history's darkest centuries, subscribe to the channel and help keep the past alive.